Hello, my name is Frank Martinelli with the Center for Public Skills Training. I'll be your presenter today. As we begin, Paula Kiley, Director of the Milwaukee Public Library, has some words of welcome for us. Paula?
Thank you, Frank, and welcome. And thanks to all of you who have joined the webinar today, including some of my library colleagues from across the country. Milwaukee Public Library is proud to sponsor today's webinar. We've offered this program before in our libraries and have always had great attendance. In fact, we had been planning to host this event at our new Good Hope branch. Unfortunately, the coronavirus got in the way. The silver lining is that the program is now being offered to you virtually, which has opened the doors to many more people. Rather than reaching 70 or 80 people in a single branch library, registration has topped more than 240 people. No matter where you live, I think you would agree that boards are a critical part of our organizations. When they and their CEOs are working in sync, aligned in their goals, and understand their distinct roles, real magic can happen. I truly believe there is both a science and an art to high-functioning boards. And I'm so fortunate that MPL has a great board that has a long-standing relationship with today's presenter. Personally, I've had the great fortune to work with Frank over the last 20 years. 2 years ago, Frank led our board retreat where we sharpened the skills of both the board members and our staff by responding to 4 scenarios that we've developed. I thought we had done a great job imagining the state of the world and the library 30 years in the future. But I can tell you this, none of our scenarios included a pandemic, the shutdown of our cities, and the greatest civil unrest seen in decades. If ever there was a time to lead, it's now. The importance of boards in any organization is critical, and the more we know, the better we'll fulfill our roles, both as board members and as executive directors. Again, thank you for joining us today. Frank?
Thanks, Paula. As Paula mentioned, given the developments of the last few months, the topic of this webinar is especially timely for nonprofits and the boards that govern them. In order for boards to lead in these uncertain times, they'll have to look different and act different. One of the ways to make this transition is to adopt the governance as leadership model. This model takes us way beyond most other governance models by challenging us to engage in something called generative thinking. Here's what we'll cover today. First, we'll look at the governance as leadership model to come to a deeper understanding of generative thinking and generative leadership. This is the missing piece for most of us. Then we'll look at some examples of generative thinking from nonprofits. Finally, we'll examine 6 tools and practices for making generative governance part of your nonprofit. I'll be covering a lot of ground today, and we only have time to introduce you to these tools and practices. But I hope the webinar will whet your appetite for more. We're in the process now of developing additional webinars and other training resources to go into each of these tools in more detail. So stay tuned. A few quick housekeeping details as we get started. Take a look at the control panel on the right side of the screen. Clicking the arrow button on top allows you to show and hide the control panel. By now, you've selected your audio option, either audio through your computer or through a dial-up telephone. And the question box. At any time, you can send questions by typing into the question box and clicking send. We'll be pausing 2 to 3 times during the webinar to take questions, but you can be submitting them at any time. Let me also say that with the large number of attendees, we may not be able to get to all of the questions during the webinar, but we promise to answer all remaining questions in the next few days. Also, the webinar handouts. In the control panel, you'll find a tab called Handouts, and you can download them during the webinar at any time. I'll also be emailing them to you right after the webinar, along with the PowerPoint presentation slides. And you'll also receive a link to the on-demand webinar recording within the next 2 days. I'd like to highlight 3 key resources. Links to these and many others are included in a bibliography in the webinar resource manual. On the left, the book Governance as Leadership by Chait, Ryan, and Taylor. This is in some ways the book that started it all in terms of the focus on generative governance. And then in the middle, Board Source, the national organization based in DC, the strongest advocate for governance as leadership. And then over on the right, the Practitioner's Guide to Governance as Leadership by Kathy Trower. Lots of tools and examples to demonstrate practical applications. Now let's take a look at the governance as leadership model. The authors propose that boards govern in 3 ways. The first, the fiduciary mode. The second, the strategic mode. And the third, the generative mode. And I'd like to go through each one of them one by one. First, the fiduciary mode. In this mode, the authors describe the board as the sentinel or the watchdog. And some of the questions that the board poses in this mode, how are we doing to date, often focus on the financial condition of the organization or program impact, for example. Are we in compliance with laws and regulations, contracts, agreements? And is there anything wrong? Is there anything out of place? And in fiduciary mode, these are some of the typical activities of a board: ensuring effective and efficient use of resources, ensuring legal compliance, fiscal accountability, and monitoring organizational results, at least at a higher level. And the authors point out that this is important. This has actually been the traditional understanding of the board as the steward or the watchdog. But the authors go on to say, as important as it is, it's just not enough. So the second mode, the strategic mode, and the word strategic is the tip-off, the board as strategist. The questions: what should we be doing, especially in times like these? Where are we going? What's the strategy? And what's the plan, as in, what's our strategic plan? And then here are some of the typical activities of the board in strategic mode: ensuring the relevance of the mission, scanning the internal and especially the external environments, monitoring higher level outcomes and impact, engaging in strategic planning, and periodically reviewing and modifying the strategic plan. The authors say that as important as a strategic mode is, that generative mode is also critical. And they describe the board in this mode as the sense maker, making sense out of things we've never had to think about before. Some of the typical questions: what's coming next for the organization and for the people we serve? What are the new questions for us? What are the new possibilities? Things like that. And in generative mode, some of the typical activities: perceive and better frame problems and opportunities, encourage robust discourse and not to be in a hurry to wrap things up, discovering new strategies, new priorities, and really coming to grips with a reality that is new, like nothing we've ever had to experience or deal with before. And then part of this is also suspending the rules of logic. And this is a hard one for most of us, but the authors really insist that this is important if we're going to tap intuition about some of these new challenges and also engage in what the authors describe as intellectual playfulness, playing around with some new ideas. Wayne Gretzky, the hockey great, was once quoted as saying, in response to the question, what makes you such a great hockey player? His response, I guess I'm really good at knowing where the puck is going to be next. And I've always looked at that as a great way to begin to think about generative mode. For our organization, for the people that we're presuming to serve, where is the puck going to be next? And to make sure that we can skate to where the puck is going to be next. Another way to think about generative mode is to ask, what are the critical uncertainties that are facing our nonprofit and the people that we serve? Later in the webinar, we'll be looking at scenario thinking and planning, an important way to set the stage for generative work. And this is probably a good time to say that during the webinar, we'll be using the terms generative mode, generative leadership, generative governance, and generative thinking interchangeably. This chart offers examples of what it looks like when the board is operating in each of these three modes. And there's a more complete version of this chart in the resource manual, along with some more information about the governance as leadership model. I'd like to make another important point. Even though we can think of these three distinct modes separately, they're really connected. Sometimes work in generative mode, making sense of something very new, can lead us into strategic planning. Sometimes fiduciary mode work, for example, studying the results of the annual audit, can uncover a critical strategic issue. And sometimes it can even get us in touch with an early warning sign that there is something big coming around the bend that fundamentally challenges our business or our revenue model. And we'll be looking at this transition from generative work to strategic work a little later on. So great boards have to be good in all three modes. We're in trouble if we only operate in fiduciary mode. For that matter, we're in trouble if we only operate in generative mode, although that might be a little more fun. It's pretty hard to fully describe what generative thinking is. This is the clearest and most concise definition I've found so far, so I'll do a dramatic reading for you. Engaging in activities that help the board take a critical look at emerging challenges from a fresh and broader perspective. Generative thinking creates a new understanding of complex and ambiguous situations that leaders may never have had to consider before, also referred to as sense-making or problem framing. And when is generative mode needed? In periods of deep, rapid change, when our goals can become ambiguous, and when we can't even agree on what our goals should be in the first place. When the future is very uncertain, when we can't even agree on what the facts are or how to make sense of them. In other words, in times like these. But one of the important points I want to make in this webinar is that before the pandemic hit, and before the streets filled with angry people demanding big changes now, we needed to be doing generative thinking, and most of us weren't. So back to the governance as leadership model. We did say that great boards have got to be good in all three modes, but because generative mode is often missing, we're going to continue to emphasize it in the webinar today. Let's talk about enablers of generative governance. This list is from Kathy Trower, and it describes the kind of organizational culture we need to build. The list also describes some of the qualities to look for in future board leaders if we intend to engage in generative work. Later on in the webinar, we'll look at some tools and practices to help build our internal capacity in some of these areas. Right now, though, let's take a look at a few of these enablers. First, a culture of inquiry. We want to encourage healthy debate in the boardroom. And in the resource bibliography, there is a great guidebook by Nancy Axelrod on the subject of building a culture of inquiry. A tolerance for ambiguity, we've talked about this already. When things are this unclear, we have to be able to deal with ambiguity and even confusion. Tapping diversity and inclusivity as an asset is another important enabler, and we'll talk more about this in just a moment. The importance of building relationships of trust. And we also need to reward risk-taking. And this is a hard one because it's been built into boards that they're supposed to be responsible for managing risks, and they are. They're not supposed to take big risks, at least At least that's been the popular wisdom. And we need to emphasize that critical link between board diversity, inclusivity, and generative thinking. The definition of inclusivity that we see here is from the important work of Robin Stacia. She's a board source consultant. And her message, if you want a board and an organization that is fully capable of generative thinking, you have to build an inclusive organization. Her article, Elevating Governance Through Inclusivity, is in the resource bibliography, and she really breaks some new ground, so I hope you'll take a look. And we know especially now that the lack of diversity and inclusion in the nonprofit sector remains a major challenge for us. Earlier, we talked about generative mode as helping us make sense of what's coming around the bend. We know that something big is approaching, but we can't see it clearly now. We can sense it. If we're going to engage in generative work, we need to be able to identify the generative challenges that require it. We need to know how to spot these kinds of challenges. So how do we spot generative challenges? Kathy Trower has identified 5 markers. These markers are signs that we're talking about, we're close to a generative challenge of some kind. So first, there's ambiguity. There are multiple interpretations of what's going on right now. There are so many examples of that today. Climate change, how to respond to COVID, what is systemic racism, and how do we eradicate it? The second marker, saliency. The issue is something that means a great deal to many, many people. High stakes. The outcome of the discussion and decision leads to questions about core values and even organizational identity. It challenges at times our very definition of what is success for our organization. Sometimes it even challenges our mission statement. Strife, there's confusion and conflict that needs to be resolved. And we know that it needs to be resolved at some point because eventually we know that we need to take action in response to this challenge. And then finally, irreversibility, the sense that, the feeling that we're faced with decisions that can't easily be revised or reversed, or at least it seems so. Let's take a look at some of the generative challenges facing our organization and communities today. First, robots making pizza, a symbol of job automation, the wave of job automation that has already begun. This would be a generative challenge for nonprofit and public sector groups looking to provide job opportunities for the underemployed and the unemployed. We need to know which jobs can be expected to disappear in the new future, in the near future. We don't want to be preparing people for jobs that may not exist at all. Next, self-driving cars. This could be a generative challenge for organizations serving persons with disabilities, older adults, and others with limited mobility. And for those kinds of organizations, is self-driving car technology an opportunity or a threat, or both? And the impact of artificial intelligence, especially on libraries and educational institutions. We're going to take a closer look at this one a little later. And more recently, the pandemic and the continuing challenge of extreme racial and economic inequality. And you know, we shouldn't be surprised by any of these events, by any of these challenges, because they've been coming around the bend for a long time, and there have been plenty of signs that we either didn't notice or in some cases we just avoided. A few more examples. We've already mentioned the impact of AI on libraries and the impact of automation on workforce development organizations. Let's take a look at just a few more examples from our recent work. For an educational partnership, the rise of new alternative education pathways to jobs is challenging the organization's 75-year reliance on the 4-year college degree program for the most part. For a community development organization, their success in neighborhood stabilization leading to higher property values now challenges the dream of affordable single-family home ownership for current residents that would like to stay in that neighborhood, but may not be able to afford to buy a home in that neighborhood. And for a women's religious order with a steep decline in recruitment, how does the order deliver its mission in a future without nuns, without vowed members? Okay, we're going to pause. We're going to take a look to see if there are any questions. And just give me 1 second here. Okay, I'm back. All right, let's just take a look at the questions. Will you cover succession planning? Absolutely. It'll come a little later in the webinar, but an important tool for the board organizing itself. Any recommendations for a starting point or a good place to focus for newer board members of startup nonprofits? Does it make sense for them to exist in one mode over the other two? It's a good question, and an initial thought right away, it seems to me that if the organization is committed to the 3 modes of governance, and of course we're advocating that position today, then it's something that we want to talk about with people before they even come onto the board. So part of the board orientation, you know, part of our process of vetting prospective board members, we talk to them about the 3 modes of governance. And we talk about why it's important to do all 3. I think with some enthusiasm, we can talk about how exciting it is to engage in generative and strategic work, maybe even offering some examples. So I would say that it begins before we bring people on. And I think especially for new people, maybe it's also part of the initial training that we offer board members. And if it's new to the rest of us, those of us that have been on the board for a while, maybe it's a training process, a training event that all of us are invited to. And then I think maybe the other thought too, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, is to make sure that especially new board members have an opportunity to engage in generative work. If, for example, one of our board committees is doing some research on an emerging challenge, make sure that we populate that task force or that committee with some of these younger board members. Let's see. Any examples of age diversity? Or any examples? You mean, I'm not sure I understand the question, so I would ask that you just give me a little bit more to go on and I'll get back to you. What if you have a hands-off board and they are barely doing the fiduciary and strategic work? Well, Frank, welcome to the real world of boards. There are no real easy answers here. I think that sometimes what that really suggests is that in the future, when we have opportunities to recruit new board members, that we make sure that we're looking for people with a yen, with a mindset, with an interest in strategic and generative work, thinking about some of the future challenges. So populating the board with individuals like that, at least long-term, is one way. I think it also starts with leadership, that it's really important, especially if this is going to be a new part of board work for your board, that you really have to get the leaders of the board, the chair, the vice president, the executive committee, some of the individuals on the board that are real influencers, to really sell them on the importance of all three modes. I think the other message is that if we're going to be relevant as an organization, and let's assume that we have board members that know that that's important. If we want to be relevant as an organization, we have really got to begin to get a handle on what's coming next. We're not going to be leaders if we don't do that kind of work. And of course, the follow-up comment, this is great, except if you have no control over who is put on your board. I know that there are situations where some of the people on our board, in some cases, maybe most of them or all of them, are appointed by people other than us, or they're appointed by people other than the current board of directors. In that kind of an instance, one of the things that has sometimes worked is to, in a sense, move upstream, to begin to talk with some of the people that have appointing power about why this approach to board governance is so important and why it's important to have board leaders that are interested in doing this kind of work. We can talk a little bit more about that, but those are some of my initial thoughts. Let's see if there are any other questions. Recently, I've heard mention of a book called The Black Swan, and that pandemics or something like the pandemic is an example of a black swan, an event that surprises everybody, looks like it's come out of nowhere, and it's having or will have a pretty significant impact on us. And in fact, what we're talking about, this notion of what's coming around the bend, we can't see it clearly, how do we make sense of it, is really related to this notion of big events that we haven't noticed, we're now noticing it, and we have to do something different. One of the other books on a similar topic is called The Gray Rhino. And while the Black Swan author describes Black Swan events as events, 9/11 is often used as an example that totally took us by surprise, that in fact, a lot of times there are signs that something like this was going to happen, and we just didn't heed those signs. In fact, that's really the premise of The Gray Rhino. Another book in a similar vein. Gray rhinos are events. Climate change is used as an example. There's no question that it's going to have significant impact, but up to this point, we've just decided to pretend that it doesn't exist or to avoid it. Another question, how can a board balance its role against that of a powerful executive director in order to prevent overreach on either sides? Good question. We're going to be talking about the working relationship between the board and the executive director in a little while. But let me mention that I think that generative governance is something that we, the board, do in partnership with our executive director. In fact, sometimes the push in the direction of the 3 modes and generative governance specifically comes from the executive director. And so I think it's really important, depending on the personality of the executive director, that if this impulse to engage in this new way of thinking about things, if it's coming from the board and not from the executive director, that we take some time to build some buy-in with her or with him. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about that relationship between the board and the executive director, specifically between the executive director and the chair of the board in just a little bit. Okay, I think we can move on. So as I mentioned, you can continue to submit questions. We're going to be stopping 2 more times before we get to the end. So let's get back. I want to talk a little bit more about the 5 markers, how you can use the 5 markers to identify generative challenges facing your nonprofit. And now today, we've already acknowledged that today, for most of us, the pandemic constitutes a major generative challenge. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, in addition to that challenge, and in addition to the challenge of racial and economic inequality, are there other generative challenges that are facing your nonprofit now and in the future, and what are they? So let's take a quick look at the 5 markers again. So spotting generative challenges. When we don't know what the generative challenges are, here's one approach that can help spot them. Let's go through a few steps here. The first step, we start by reviewing the 5 markers, making sure that we're all clear about their meaning and some examples that make their meaning clear. Then next, we brainstorm a list of possible generative challenges facing your nonprofit, your community, or your field of work. I want to point out that depending on the scope of this effort, we may be focusing on something larger than just our nonprofit, our community, for example. And especially with this second step, it's helpful to think in terms of critical uncertainties, emerging forces and factors that are looming around the bend that could have serious impact. Next, we assess the list of possible generative challenges using the 5 markers. And then at some point, we select a challenge or maybe 2 challenges for more focused attention. And then we begin to explore the selected generative challenge, learning as much as we can about it. This learning leads to the sense making, which is an important part of getting a handle on a generative challenge. And if you're wondering who would do some of this work, it could be a board committee, it could be a board and staff team, it could be a special work group, or a community task force. In any case, though, it's important that the board is involved. We have to engage the board in activity like this because we're talking about board work. We're talking about generative mode, which is part of the board's responsibility. Once we identify a generative challenge, we're ready to explore and learn together about it. This can actually be a pretty exciting part of the process. We can organize our initial analysis using the format of this generative challenge brief that you see on screen. Some of the questions that are included, we start by asking, related to this generative challenge that we've identified, what are some of the new questions that we're going to need answers to? What do we need to learn about? And are there any additional resources that we can tap to help us with this learning? And are there any barriers, obstacles, or ways of thinking that might get in the way of doing some fresh thinking about this generative challenge? Another term for um, ways of thinking, uh, mental models, and we'll be giving that some special attention in just a bit. At this point, we begin to develop a plan of information gathering and research. Remember, we're trying to make sense out of something that we've never had to deal with before. So it really is a deep learning process. Here's another way to picture how we organize some of this initial sense making and problem framing that we need to do. In step one, we determine the generative challenge that we'll focus on. In step two, we figure out what it is we need to learn if we're going to make sense of this new challenge. And I use the expression learning objectives, organizational learning objectives. So we're real clear about what it is we need to learn. And in step three, we get organized to move forward with a concrete learning plan. Here's an example of this approach from a public library that identified artificial intelligence, AI, as a generative challenge. Let's look at each step and how they approached it. In the first column, the first step, they've identified the generative challenge. What will AI mean for libraries in terms of workforce and library service in the future? And then in the next step, identifying the learning objectives, what is artificial intelligence and related technologies? Things like machine learning, blockchain, virtual reality, augmented reality, etc. What are the opportunities and threats that these new technologies pose for libraries and other learning objectives? You'll find a more detailed version of this library example in the resource manual. And then in the third step, just in terms of moving forward, I mean, who's going to do this learning and this research? Appoint a AI task force to explore the future impact and use of AI and to educate the board and staff on the subject. Translating generative thinking into critical strategic issues. I want to talk about this transition. We talked earlier about how generative work can lead to strategic work. This is really a critical translation that takes place often. We know that generative work doesn't stop with just identifying the challenge and then making sense out of it. We know that at some point we have to make decisions and we have to take action. Often our generative work can lead to a new understanding of what the critical strategic issues are for our organization at this point in time. And then these issues can be addressed in a strategic planning process. Here's one example from a public library, again, translating a generative challenge into an actionable critical strategic issue. So the example, the generative challenge, which we've already looked at, what will artificial intelligence mean for libraries in the future? So is there a way that we can grab onto that challenge, which is pretty big and broad, to begin to think about the action steps? What do we do about this? So for this library with this generative challenge, a potential strategic issue might read, what kinds of information and training will best prepare library leaders to explore the impact and benefits of AI for workforce and service provision in the future? So you can see from broad to a more focused statement that very likely will end up with goals and strategies that spell out what we're going to do to begin to bring up to speed library leaders on this vital topic. Here's another way to look at this transition from generative work to strategic planning. After identifying the generative challenge to work on, in step 2, we translate our generative insights, what we're learning, the sense that we're making of things, into critical strategic issue statements. And then in step 3, we determine the actions to address the identified issues. So what we're really seeing is that generative work leads to the identification of critical strategic issues, which in turn can lead to an updated strategic plan of action. I'm highlighting this translation because I think it's a real important part of taking the generative challenge that we now have begun to understand and turning it into action. Here's another example of this transition using that last 3-step process, this transition from generative mode to strategic. This example comes from a national educational partnership that is a unique collaboration between students, institutions of higher learning, and the metal casting industry. And they've been around for 75 years. And over that 75 years, they've built their work primarily around the traditional 4-year college degree pathway. But what they've begun to recognize is that there are really big changes emerging in higher ed, in the metal casting industry itself, and also in the learning needs and styles and preferences of today's students. And based on that, they identified the following generative challenge. You can see it there. How should the partnership respond to deep changes in the metal casting industry, secondary and post-secondary education, and the future learning needs of students? How will the partnership model need to evolve over the next 10 plus years? And you'll notice that the wording is need to evolve, not should it evolve or something less insistent that we have to respond to this challenge. This is an example of an organization that used that generative issue brief format that we looked at earlier to conduct their research. They also developed a generative thinking resource bibliography to deepen understanding of the challenge among all of the board, staff, and committee leadership. So this wasn't just an activity, a sense-making activity that involved a small committee or a work group. There was a commitment on the part of board leadership and executive staff that we all have to make this learning journey together. The next step was to translate their sense-making into a set of strategic issues. And here's one of the strategic issues they identified. And they labeled the issue theme, if you will, moving upstream. We've got to move upstream. How can the partnership increase knowledge and awareness of metal casting industry career opportunities among high school age students? So not just starting with higher education, but moving upstream. This and other strategic issues led this organization to a refresh of their strategic plan. And I think the thing to point out here again is that this whole process began with generative work responding to this sense that things are really changing big and we better understand it. So here's that 3-step process. If we're going to engage in generative work, we need to understand what some of the barriers are. We've touched on some of these already, but I want to take a closer look at a few of them. The first one, outmoded or obsolete ways of thinking about things. Mental models is one of the words that is used to describe these ways of thinking. And while the public libraries and library leaders have been great examples of leaders doing generative work, path-breaking work, it wasn't always this way. Some of the older mental models about libraries, for example, a library is a physical building that is filled with books and shelves, for example, made it that much harder to think about emerging technologies that had the potential for transformative change. And I don't want to just single out libraries and librarians. All of us fall into the trap of operating from mental models that have just grown obsolete, and they get in the way of this kind of sense making. The lack of diversity and generative leadership skills is another major barrier for nonprofit organizations and especially their boards of directors. The most recent research points out that even though there's been lots of talk about diversifying our boards of directors, that in fact the mix of diversity today is basically the same as it was 20 years ago. Meeting design is really important. It's when the board does its work, and often the agendas are organized primarily for fiduciary work, not strategic and generative work, although this has probably changed a bit in the last few months. And then finally, a board chair and CEO that are not organized for strategic and generative work is going to be a major barrier. So what do we do? Well, for the rest of our time together, we'll start to answer this question. I'd like you to take a look at this list of strategies and tools. Here are some of the core strategies and tools that can equip your board for generative work, for leading in uncertain times. The first three are activities that foster and support generative thinking, scenario thinking and planning, working on our mental models, and reassessing our theories of change, our program logic models, and our business models, especially in this period of very dramatic, deep change. And then the next three are internal practices that help the board get it together so that it's got the right structures, the right people to do scenario thinking, some of the other activities that go into generative work. So redesign board and committee meetings, foster a dynamic relationship between the CEO and the board chair, and build a talent pipeline of board leaders equipped for generative work. And I want to mention there's a lot more material in the webinar resource manual and especially in the bibliography on all of the 6 tools and on the 3 modes of governance in general. The first tool is scenario thinking and planning, and we've heard a lot about this activity during the last several months. If we're looking for a way to see around the bend at what's coming next, scenario thinking and planning can really help. That's why so many groups are beginning to engage in it. The time frame for scenario planning can be 5, 10, 20, even 30 years out. But in response to the pandemic, scenario planning is now being used to figure out the more immediate future. For example, getting to January 2021. What strategies will get us there? But we need to remember that what's happening right now is not going to be over conveniently at the end of 2020. And so we also need to engage in scenario thinking for a longer time frame as well. I think that this is really important. Either way, though, the development of alternative future scenarios is a powerful way to foster generative thinking, to make sense of what's around the bend. To start us off, I'd like to draw a distinction between typical strategic planning, sometimes referred to as forecast-based strategic planning, and scenario-based planning. First, typical strategic planning. In less volatile environments, organizations can more easily make some estimates about how things will be, how things will play out, and then set strategy accordingly. So strategic planning usually assumes that the future will be pretty much like the past with some slight variances, and you can see that suggested in the graphic on screen. In terms of the governance as leadership model, what we're looking at right now is strategic mode in action. But when the future is unlikely, or rather likely to be very different, like now, scenario thinking and planning is needed. Here, leaders explore different possible futures and identify strategies that could work in each. And in terms of the governance as leadership model, this is an example of generative mode in action. So the idea is to develop a set of alternative scenarios for the future. And we need to be clear, scenario thinking is not trying to predict the future because we can't predict the future. What we're trying to do, though, is develop some plausible stories about how the future might play out for our organization and the people that we serve. Scenario thinking usually begins with identifying a focal theme or domain. For example, how will K-12 education evolve in the age of pandemics? Or what will the future of racial justice work in our region be like? And while there are many approaches to scenario thinking and planning, I've tried to summarize the general sequence here. First, we identify critical uncertainties facing us. Then we construct alternative future scenarios based on those uncertainties. Then we flesh out each resulting future scenario story. And then we develop strategies for operating in each future. And what I'd like to do is walk through the steps using a couple of examples. Scenario thinking typically starts with determining critical uncertainties, and we've referred to that term earlier. These are forces or factors that are playing out in the future, in our future, that look like they will have high impact on our organizations and the people we serve. But we're just not sure at this point how things are going to play out. Will it go this way or will it go that way? Often we become aware of critical uncertainties when we're doing research on the generative challenges we might have already identified. We develop an initial list of critical uncertainties and select two that are high impact and highly uncertain. And I want to point out here that the goal is not to come up with, quote, the two right answers, but rather to work with two uncertainties that seem really important to us. Here are some examples of critical uncertainties in the times that we now live in. The nature of public opinion on critical issues, shifts in social values, the frequency and the severity of future pandemic outbreaks, the degree of public support for racial justice work, the outcome of the November election and the aftermath of that outcome over the next 4 to 8 years, and the severity of future revenue losses. At the state and federal level, there are already incredible budget shortfalls that are being projected. And right now, it's just not clear exactly how that's going to play out. Let's look at two critical uncertainties from a public library scenario thinking exercise. The two future relevance of a public library and resources to support a public library. And as I mentioned, we use the critical uncertainties to begin to develop a picture of different ways the future might play out. So we construct alternative future scenarios based on the combination of the two critical uncertainties we selected. So let's look at 4 scenarios for a public library. And here you see the two critical uncertainties. One of them becomes the horizontal or x-axis, the blue line, resources that would be available to support a public library in the future, ranging from scarce to abundant. And so the usual practice is to create this kind of a template, this kind of matrix, and then at the ends of the axes, state things in an extreme way. So in this case, resources for future support of public libraries will either be scarce or they'll be abundant. And the other one becomes the vertical or x-axis, the red axis, the future relevance of a public library. How important will libraries be in the lives of people, ranging from low relevance to high relevance? And then here's the result. Four broad alternative scenarios for a public library. Each future plays off of the combination of the two critical uncertainties that we've selected. Now, certainly our work is not over, but this begins to give us a kind of a broad picture of ways that the future might play out for us. And it's usually recommended that in scenario thinking and planning, we work with 3 or 4 scenarios. Here's another example for a YWCA, an organization whose mission is the elimination of racism and the economic empowerment of women. The two critical uncertainties, you can see them, are public support for racial justice work, ranging from weak to strong, and the nature of the economic and jobs recovery, ranging from low wage to living wage. What's interesting about this scenario template is that it was first created over 10 years ago in 2009, right after the election of President Obama, and at the start of the last Great Recession. And it looks to me like it's still relevant today, and not just for the YWCA, for many of us. And then one more example, 4 scenarios for January 2021. Here's a scenario template with a much shorter time frame developed by the group Breakwater Strategies. The critical uncertainties here, the rate of COVID infection and death, and again, the nature of the economic and jobs recovery. You'll find a link to this document in the resource bibliography. It's very detailed, and it could provide some guidance to some nonprofits depending on their mission. Give it a close look, though. I think you'll find some insights and discoveries of theirs that might be useful in your own scenario thinking efforts. I wanted to mention, too, there are a number of other scenario thinking tools in the bibliography. Some are very good for figuring out 2020, so a shorter time frame. But remember, it's not over. It's not going to be over anytime soon. So we need also to be working with a longer time frame as well. So there's a real good selection of tools that I think you can draw from. The next step, after we've created the template or the matrix, is to flesh out each scenario. What would be happening in each future? Here are some questions to stimulate thinking. What is the impact of this future scenario on our nonprofit and the people we served? How will our network of partners and collaborators be disrupted? This is important because often we provide our services with others. There's a network of collaborators that we work with. What would be the headlines in this future scenario? What actions would we take to advance our mission if we knew this were the future? And then from Breakwater Strategies, the suggestion to think about what strategic bets would we make in each future. I think it also helps to review relevant trend summaries and other research that might be available and might be relevant for the scenarios that you're looking at. And then after we fully developed the scenarios, we work with them. What can we learn? Do we have a better understanding now of the challenges facing our organization? What's the impact on our ways of thinking, our mental models? And as I mentioned, we're going to look at that again after the next question break. And then what are the strategies for operating strategically in each new future? And with any of those strategies, are there any strategies that look like they could work in more than one future? I refer to these as resilient strategies. Let's talk about resilient strategies a bit more. As we just mentioned, identification of strategies that could work in multiple futures is one of the important outcomes of scenario thinking. I'd like to offer a few examples of resilient strategies that have begun to arise in the nonprofit sector. Some of them have arisen from scenario thinking efforts. Some of them have emerged out of less formal efforts to decide on courses of action that make sense in this period of great uncertainty. And no doubt, many of you attending this webinar have embraced some of these strategies already. The first, testing out ways to deliver the mission, to do our work in virtual and remote modes. The second, maintaining and deepening the organization's presence, connection, and relationships with key stakeholders, our clients, our partners, members, community residents, leaders, the board, staff, donors, etc. Number three, now and in the future, this one I think will be especially important, to position the organization to pivot quickly as quickly as possible in response to emerging new normals. And you'll notice that new normals is plural because there will be a number of them. As we learn more about the duration and the degree of physical distancing that is required to decide what that means in terms of how we do our work. For example, when it's safe to meet again in person, we're ready to go fast. And when conditions change, as they very likely will, we're able to shift gears again and to do that fairly rapidly and not in a way that, in any way hurts the people that we serve. And then the fourth one, exploring strategic restructuring options to advance our mission. I can tell you this is going to be hard for most of us. Because we're just not used to even thinking about not existing the way we always have. But it seems to me this fourth strategy, considering this and pursuing strategic restructuring options, is something that is going to be it's going to be on the table because it's clear that there are many nonprofits that are not likely to make it alone in the future. We're already seeing evidence of that. A recent report from the Helen Bader Nonprofit Institute indicated, I believe, that 1 out of 3 nonprofits surveyed thought that they would be just out of cash in 2 months, in 8 weeks, if I'm not incorrect. There are some good resources in the bibliography around this theme of strategic restructuring options, so I hope you'll take a look. All right, we're going to go to questions again. And just give me a moment to catch up. What are some good methods for communicating these 3 modes of governance with the other stakeholders in an organization? Well, one thought that comes to mind, a moment ago, we were talking about the importance of maintaining contact with stakeholders like partners and especially funders. You know, it seems to me that we might even think about doing some kind of, call it a leadership briefing. Letting people that really mean something to us, letting them know that because things are changing so rapidly, our organization has decided to expand the reach of its board governance. And you know, while I'm thinking of it, even though the focus today is on board governance, that virtually everything we're talking about applies to the staff of nonprofits as well. It seems to me that we're going to be in a much stronger position if both board and staff become conversant in the skills, in the competencies of generative leadership. So one possibility might be to organize a leadership briefing for key stakeholders, letting them know what we're doing in terms of generative governance, and maybe even describing it, some of the activities, scenario thinking, for example, in ways that suggest that if they're interested, they can be involved in these activities with us. I think all other things being equal, we're going to be more attractive to our partners, especially donors, if we come off as an organization that is really thoughtful about what's coming next, about the future. And probably like the rest of us, they're looking for some leadership anyway. And so I think that that just would put you in a good light. And let's see. Oh, excuse me. I didn't mean to do that. Um, Here's a good question. Should nonprofits engage in generative work without fundamentally questioning if their organization is necessary in the first place? It seems that many nonprofits are so focused on surviving regardless of threats or concerns that they don't have the courage to acknowledge that and or don't acknowledge that perhaps at least some shouldn't be around in the first place. That's a strong question, and I would say I would agree with the questioner that this is an important question. It seems to me that sometimes that conversation, that discussion about our mission relevance could happen before engaging in generative work. I'm also thinking right now that if you thought that that might be a pretty hard sell for board and staff leaders, that beginning some sort of a generative, some kind of a sense-making process, whether it be scenario thinking, examining mental models, we'll talk about that after this question break, that engaging in those kinds of activities might, let's say, more naturally lead to the conclusion or at least the thought that this is something we really have to consider. It might make it an easier sell because that sense of things that just maybe we've outlived our usefulness emerges for all of us. Will we be able to view this recorded webinar again? If so, when will it be available? Yeah, you'll get a link to the recording in about 2 days and within 2 days. And then what I typically do is convert it to an MP4 file, and it'll be on YouTube. And I'll get that link out to you when it's available. One person, I can't download the Word document for the main resource. I'm not going to be able to fix that right now, but as I mentioned, right after the webinar, we're going to be emailing that document to you. What is an estimated timeline for implementing a generative thinking process? Would you recommend outsourcing this process to a consultant? Well, you know, a couple of thoughts right off the bat. I mentioned earlier that some of the tools that are available to do scenario thinking, in fact, some of the good work that's being done right now is being done within a real compressed time frame, not what's happening over the next 10 years, but what's happening over the next 6 months. And so it seems to me that, and again, let me mention that there are a number of really user-friendly resources in the resource bibliography on how to do that. And the facilitation notes that come with a number of these suggest to me that you would do just fine facilitating this internally. Sometimes you might decide that you need a consultant, but you know, as Bob Dylan once said, you don't need a weather vane to know which way the wind blows. So you might want to just take a look at some of the tools that are available through the resource bibliography. There are links to all of them, and they're all free. And then just decide at that point. In terms of a time reference, it seems to me you could do some credible scenario thinking in, I'm going to say, in 3 or 4 hours. You know, I don't want to I don't want to pander to the need that people feel right now to get moving ASAP. We don't want to waste time, but we're talking about the future for our organization. So that would be my suggestion. Oh, great. This is a good question. What assumptions does generative mode make? It seems a sophisticated approach. Is it truly accessible by multiple stakeholders? I'm going to make a suggestion here that even though the initial reaction might be, especially with respect to something like scenario thinking, what do I have to be a trained futurist in order to do this? I'll use myself as an example. The learning curve, there was a learning curve. But once you get comfortable with the process, once you get comfortable with the tools, it's something that most of us can handle. I also tend to look at some of the tools that we're talking about as public skills. These are things that leaders, citizens in a democracy need in order to function effectively as citizens. So I think there might be a need for some orientation, maybe a couple of examples, maybe even using parts of this webinar recording. But I would say that this is something that all boards and all leaders can embrace. And we can talk about that a little more if that response is not adequate. Okay, let's forge ahead. So we've talked about mental models. This is another practice for fostering generative work, to surface them and to examine our mental models. So what are mental models? We've talked a little bit about them already. Mental models, the term is just another way of labeling the deep beliefs, the assumptions, and the paradigms we hold about how things work. They shape the decisions we make and the actions we take. They also determine how we interpret the behaviors and actions of others. And I think what's really important is that most of the time, we don't talk about mental models. They have incredible influence on what we do, but we don't talk about them. And sometimes we're not even aware of their existence and the fact that they influence us so strongly. Take a look at the graphic down at the bottom of the slide. We see the world through our mental models. For nonprofit organizations, the important question to ask is, what shared mental models do we operate from? Are they changing? And do they need to change, especially in this period of deep transformation? The last 4 months have certainly challenged many of our mental models about some pretty important things: our role in the community, how we do our work as nonprofits, how change comes about, how we build and maintain personal and work relationships, and so much more. What's coming around the bend often challenges our ways of thinking about things. Even in less turbulent times, it's important to service and examine our mental models. And once we've brought them out into the light, and that's the right expression because they're usually below the surface. So once we've brought them out into the light, we can decide if they still work or if they've become obsolete in some way. And so I think especially in response in the wake of the pandemic and the racial justice uprising throughout the country and worldwide, what are some of the mental models and beliefs and assumptions of nonprofits and their leaders that have been challenged by these events? And there's an important connection to be made between scenario thinking and the work of surfacing and examining our mental models. We can work on these things in isolation, but they really go hand in hand. Some of the groups that we've worked with recently have simultaneously engaged in both activities in parallel tracks and then joined the two tracks together. This interplay represented by the graphic between mental models and future scenarios is really important. They influence each other. On the one hand, our mental models, beliefs, and assumptions influence our efforts to think about the future and develop alternative scenarios about how the future might unfold for us. And then at the same time, scenario planning can stretch our thinking about emerging challenges and opportunities that the future might hold for us, and in the process, alter some of our mental models. So again, the two really go hand in hand in some important ways. And in the resource manual, there is a mental models exercise that might be a good introduction to exploring some of the mental models at play in your organization. And then the last practice I want to highlight in terms of fostering generative work, and in some cases resulting from generative work, is reassessing our theories of change, our program logic models, and our business models. And a theory of change, just in terms of definition, a description of the strategies that a nonprofit plans to use to achieve its intended mission impact. And the business model describes how a nonprofit intends to generate the resources needed to support its work. And if ever there was a time for generative thinking about these things, it's here and now. I think it also relates to the question having to do with examining the future relevance of a nonprofit. As we try to figure out the future for our organizations and our work, there's a great risk of building on theories of change and business models that were well suited for the old normal, but are way out of step with the new world that we're entering. And I just see too many examples of that, I've got to say. The concepts and tools of systems thinking offer us lots of resources for this reassessment of our work. In the time that we have today, I'd like to single out root cause analysis as one such tool. Root cause analysis can help us take a fresh look at the problems we work on, uncover the deeper root causes of those problems, and devise more effective strategies for the future. The image of the iceberg is often used in thinking and in talking about root causes. So much of our work stays at the level of symptoms of problems. And at the same time, we continue to address the symptoms of problems. We have to. Now's the time to go deeper and begin to address root causes of problems in new ways. Part of this work involves understanding some of the mental models that keep problems in place. Our mental models, for example, of how change takes place. Our mental models around why are some people poor and remain poor, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of very accessible tools for root cause analysis. Here's one of them. It's called the Keep Asking Why worksheet. We start with a persistent problem or issue, and then using this tool, we get to root causes by repeatedly asking the question, why is this happening? And as a result, we go deeper and deeper. And for most of us, as we go deeper, as we keep on, at least in terms of using this tool, as we keep on asking why, we make sense out of things. So I think for me, it's just another way of thinking about going deeper, coming to a deeper understanding. I think that sometimes this can result from other forms of generative work. It's an important step. And then armed with a deeper understanding of root causes, nonprofit leaders can begin to consider ways to think differently and smarter about their work. So the root cause analysis could be an example of generative mode. Turning that knowledge that results could be an example of the transition from generative to strategic. They begin to think about different ways of doing their work. They can revise their theories of change and business models. They can redesign programs and launch new initiatives to have greater impact at the root cause level. They can enter into partnerships and alliances with organizations that are already tackling a community problem at its root. And they can also get to root causes by linking a problem to other community systems. And some examples: reframing racism and gun violence as public health issues, reframing poverty as structural violence. The other thing that we might do is divest. It's a hard thing to do for nonprofits, but decide that there isn't a need for a particular program or service anymore, and we need to let go of it. And reconsidering mental models and applying our new understanding of root causes sets the stage for these actions. Okay, time is flying, so I'd like to pick up the pace. Now let's talk about the ways a board itself needs to organize internally for strategic and generative work. And I'd like to touch on the next three practices. First, redesigning board and committee meetings. Second, developing a future-focused partnership between the board chair and the CEO or executive director. And three, building a talent pipeline of board leaders equipped to do strategic and generative work. Meetings deserve special attention because they are a point of high leverage in terms of positioning our boards and our organizations to do strategic and generative work. And in these meetings is where the big issues are debated and where the big decisions get made. So we want to move from a focus on the past and present to more of a focus on the future in board meetings. Starting on the left, here's what meetings often look like. We spend a lot of time listening to reports. We use the same agenda structure month after month and year after year. And financial reports are important. Other reports are important, but there's other stuff to do. Over on the right, we see a picture of where we'd like things to be. So more of a focus on the future. Meetings are outcome driven around, for example, major decisions that need to be made, major education that needs to take place. There's an emphasis on participation and action, deliberation on critical issues, in general, using our meetings for strategic and generative work. We looked at this three-column chart at the beginning of the webinar. It offers examples of what it looks like when the board is operating in each of the three modes. And I don't want to suggest that there's a rigid formula either. So we're not talking 1/3 fiduciary, 1/3 strategic, 1/3 generative. But I think for most of us, we are definitely talking about more generative than what we've been doing. In the course of the year, we just want to make sure that the board is spending time doing all three. Right now, we know that boards are probably spending a lot of time in fiduciary mode, and they need to. But this is also a time when we have to be engaged in strategic and generative mode as well. There are no easy answers here. Somehow we have to figure out how to do all three. There's an assessment exercise for meeting redesign based on this chart in the resource manual. And also be sure to take a look at Kathy Trower's meeting techniques for generative boards. And one more resource in the bibliography, there's a guide to hosting virtual meetings, which have become especially important. The next practice focuses on this all-important relationship between the board chair and the CEO. One of the best resources on this relationship is the research of Mary Hyland. Her findings are summarized in the article, The Board Chair Executive Director Relationship, Dynamics that Create Value for Nonprofits. The board chair and the CEO need to be committed to strategic and generative work, and they need to invest in building a relationship to support it. Mary found that a strong board chair CEO relationship is built on three things. First, the working relationship it really focuses on building high levels of trust. Second, being strategic and generative about the work that they focus on together. This is really important. The practices that we've been covering, scenarios, mental models, reassessing our theories of change, if this work is going to engage the board, and it really has to, it will require the board chair and CEO working closely together as a team. And our third point, the depth of their interactions with each other. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. One of the highlights of our article is a description of how the board chair and the CEO can deepen their relationship over time. Especially if they're working together for the first time, the interaction starts with one-way fact and ID sharing, then moves on to sharing a deeper knowledge of things. They begin to share feelings, and then eventually they're able to really engage with a spirit of give and take. They can get into good arguments about things. They can take each other on. They can engage in difficult conversations. You'll find a link to Mary's article in the resource bibliography. And also, there are a few other resources in the manual pertaining to this. Make sure you take a look. And then finally, building a board talent pipeline. Just a couple of comments about this. We need to engage leaders. We need to find leaders that are equipped to do strategic and generative work. Let's start with a short description of the board succession planning process from the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM for short. They define it as a long-term strategy that assures a dependable and continuous supply of prospective board leaders with the needed passion, commitment, and skills. It's a comprehensive leadership development process with a lot of different kinds of involvement options. We use our standing committee structure, ad hoc structures, as places where new leaders can develop. And everything that we do in terms of succession reflects our commitment to board diversity and inclusion. These are some of the leadership competencies that we're going to be looking for as we recruit new leaders. That 3-column chart that we looked at earlier can also provide some guidance on what to look for. In the resource manual, you'll see this graphic, the life cycle of a board leader. The basic message is that we have to do more thinking about when people are engaged in committee work before they come onto the board, and also when they leave the board in terms of board service. We want to keep them engaged at every step. And then there is also, you'll get it in the PowerPoint file, this succession grid that is also one of the tools developed by SHRM. There are links to some of their other excellent board succession tools. So, a recap of the tools. I know we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sorry to say that we're not going to be able to get to the remaining questions in the time that we have, but I want to assure you that we will respond. And what we usually do is put together a summary of all the questions, all the answers, and just send that out, without names, of course, send that out to everybody so you'll have the benefit of some of those other questions and answers. So again, I'm sorry, we don't have time for more questions. I've mentioned the resource bibliography. Take a look. It's just filled with really great resources. For the most part, just a click away and available at no charge. Here are some suggestions about what to do next. Review and share the resource bibliography with other people in your organization. Register for some of the upcoming webinars we'll be offering that will go into these tools in more depth, and also look for, from time to time, other resource packets on generative work that we will send to you. All right. So I think in closing, I'd like to share a few thoughts with you. To say that we're living in extraordinary times would be the greatest understatement of all times. Except for very old people who have experienced events like the First and Second World Wars or the Great Depression, most of us alive today have never experienced anything like this. We're hoping that the worst will be over soon, but I've got to tell you, there are so many signs that this may be wishful thinking at best. The pandemic is not just a health crisis, it's an ongoing economic crisis, it's a social justice crisis, it's a nonprofit sector crisis, and so much more. No answers to give here, but I do have a deep belief that some of the best answers and solutions now will come from the same people that they've always come from. People like you, leaders of nonprofit organizations, and building boards that are capable of the kind of leadership skills we've been talking about today will be an important part of that hopeful future. Again, thanks for attending. Best wishes, and let's keep each other safe.